Well, hello everybody. How nice for me to see all of you and to introduce our activity for this morning's service. Now, some of you will know that there will be another service appearing on YouTube or on Facebook later today, and that is the pet service that lots of you have had a part in producing. So have a look out for that as well. In this morning's service, in the Bible reading, in the Gospel reading that Hannah's going to read to us in a bit, Jesus, and I've got him here, Jesus talks to his disciples. He gives them some advice. He gives them some advice about how to get along with one another as members of the church. And he also gives them some advice about what to do if things go a bit wrong. He gives them advice about what to do if they argue with one another, if they fall out with one another, and if they feel a bit cross with one another. And our activity today is going to think a bit about that. But before we get on to the activity, I want to show you something that somebody showed me in our church just a little while ago. So we're going to go in and have a look. So here we are inside the church. If you've not been inside the church since we have had this coronavirus to deal with, you might not know that something really good happened whilst we were in lockdown. I wonder if you came into church, for example, at Christmas or on a Sunday in January or February. You might now, when you look at the church, notice that something has disappeared. I wonder if you can notice. I'm giving you a clue now. Something that was there is not there anymore, and that something is the carpet. We had a long reddish coloured carpet, didn't we, in our church? But the problem with that carpet was that it was getting very old, and also it was getting a bit kind of ruckled up, and people, including me, kept nearly tripping over it. So we thought it was a good idea to get rid of that carpet, and getting rid of the carpet has revealed this beautiful pattern on our church floor, a pattern in the tiles. But have a look here. Oh, can you see? Somebody some time ago, I don't know when this happened, somebody must have done some work on our church floor. And can you see, when they put the tiles back, I'm going to put my foot here. When they put the tiles back, they didn't put them in the same pattern. There are lots of squares here. But on this one, the squares are in the wrong place, aren't they? Something has gone a bit wrong. And you know what? Somebody said to me they thought it would be a good idea if we got those tiles back in the right place, so it made a beautiful square. But I have been thinking about that. And I have been thinking about that especially when I was thinking about today's Bible reading. Because the thing about churches, and I think this is something, well, I know, this is something that Jesus knew all about. There he is. The thing about churches and about people in churches is that, do you know what? Because we're people, we're just human beings, sometimes things go a bit wrong. People aren't always in perfect patterns and perfect order. Sometimes things go a bit wrong and we start falling out with one another. And Jesus knows all about that. And I quite like the fact that on our floor, it sort of reminds us about that. It reminds us that our church family, like any family, or maybe any class in your school, or any club or any group, it's always a bit tricky sometimes to get along well. Things feel a bit out of place. And Jesus gives us some advice today. He gives us, the disciples, some advice about how to get along. Now, we're going to get on with the beginning of our activity. We're going to go into the meeting room. So here we are in the meeting room, and here is Jesus teaching his disciples about how to get along better with one another. I think probably the reason why it's sometimes a bit tricky to get on with one another is that we're all different, isn't it? If you look at these disciples, they're all a bit different, aren't they? You can tell they're different on the outside because some have got brown hair, some have got white hair, some have got red clothes, some have got white clothes. But actually we're all different on the inside, aren't we? We've all got different personalities, different things that we like and different things that we don't like, things that annoy us and don't annoy other people. We're all quite different. So here comes our activity, thinking about how different we are. So what I thought we might do, if you'd like to, is make the outline of a church. I'm going to do that with some cardboard. So I've got a cardboard box. I'm going to just pull that cardboard box apart so that I can make some flat, there we are, there's some flat shape. And I'm just going to cut out the shape of our church. Just cut it first into an oblong so it's easier to work with. There we go. Now our church has got a tower, hasn't it? And then it's got, it's called the nave, the body of the church, and then it's got a bit on the end which we call the chancel. There we are, there's the shape of our church. Now I'm only doing mine quickly. It's got those squares at the top, hasn't it? Castellations, we call those. There we go. I'm only doing mine quickly, but you might take some time. Right, so there's an outline of a church. The next thing, now I prepared this bit at home, I got some coloured paper. I'll take that out. Now, our church building on the outside just looks all grey, doesn't it? I could just stick grey squares on there and it would look a bit like our church building. Grey brick on the outside, but we are thinking about the church as the people. Because when the Bible talks about the church, it means not the building. They didn't have church buildings in those days. The church meant the group of people, the community of faith. So, in a community of faith, as we know, we are not all grey, we're not all the same colour. We are different, aren't we? Different personalities, different ages, different things we like and we don't like. Yeah, different. So what I'm going to do to represent our different community is cut coloured strips of paper. I've done that already. If you haven't got coloured paper, you could cut white paper and then colour it different colours. I'm going to put some glue on my church, like that, and I am going to start to stick these different colours on there. Now, if you wanted to, remembering our church floor, you could stick them in a pattern. I haven't got time to stick mine in a pattern. But if I had time, I might think, right, I'm going to stick mine in a pattern just to remind me of our church floor and remind us actually that the patterns are all different because we're different people and sometimes the patterns sort of go a bit wrong. And that is just because we're all different, which can be a very good thing and can also be a tricky thing to deal with. There we go. So if I had time, I would cover my whole church like a mosaic to remind me that in our church family, and I don't mean just St Andrew's Church, because when we talk about the church, we mean Christians throughout the world. Something we've been really lucky to have in lockdown is our friends. Do you remember Elijah and Xavier who read the reading at Pentecost? Well, I know that they and their grandma and their sisters and one of their brothers, they join in our service in the United States of America every Sunday. Isn't that brilliant? So the church means all of us, wherever we are and however different we are, could start sticking and cover the whole church building to remind you of that. Another thing, do you remember I said that Jesus, here he is again, gives his disciples some advice in our gospel reading about how to get on? Well, you have a listen when Hannah reads the gospel reading about what the advice is. Another activity, if you want to do a church, you could do this afterwards or before, is to write down your advice based on what you know about Jesus. What would your advice be about how to get on with one another well? Now, the advice, remember I told you that in the Bible, the Old Testament, in the Jewish synagogue, the Old Testament, here's some words from the prophet Isaiah. He will be called Mighty God, talking about the Messiah that was to come. The Old Testament is written on scrolls, and in the Jewish synagogues, still, when the scriptures are read, they're read from scrolls. An interesting thing about the New Testament is that they are written on parchments, like sort of flat bits of, well, what became paper. That's one of the very oldest bits of parchment. It's tiny, tiny, tiny. That's in a museum in Manchester, and those are Greek words, do you see, written on it from John's Gospel. So maybe for your advice, you might like to make yourself a bit of parchment. I'm just going to cut the edges a bit sort of scruffily, because that's how parchment edges were. There we are. And what would your advice be? Well, I'll tell you what Jesus' advice is to his disciples. I think the most important thing that Jesus says to his disciples comes at the very end of the gospel reading. He says, where 2 or 3 are gathered in my name, I am there with them. I think that makes a real difference. If we're having a bit of a struggling time, we can feel a bit on our own, can't we? But Jesus is promised, and this is a really important thing that keeps happening. Jesus keeps saying this in Matthew's Gospel. He keeps promising, I am with you. So we know that even when we are having a struggling time, Jesus is with us. Maybe that helps us. So on my parchment, I'm actually going to do that as my first bit of advice. And there we are. If I put it there, you can see. So I might put advice, or I might put top tips. There we are. Those are top tips for getting on well. Top tips or advice. And my first bit of advice from Jesus is remember, I am with you. That's number 1. Advice from Jesus, remember, I am with you. And then the advice that Jesus gives his disciples when he's talking to them today, he says, if you fall out with one another, or if somebody's done something to upset you, the first thing you should do is just go yourself and have a little chat to that person. And then Jesus says, if that doesn't work, go back to have another chat with that person, but take a couple of your friends with you to have another chat. And then he says, if that doesn't work, go and see somebody in the whole church and have a chat to them and think what you might do about it. So that's Jesus' advice, but you might have different bits of advice to give about how to get along. What works well for you? You could write that on your parchment. The thing that Jesus says when he's talking, he talks about heaven and about God at the same time. And that's an amazing thing to think about, isn't it? That somehow the way that we get on with one another when we are part of the Christian community, the way that we get on with one another, in some mysterious way, that has something to do with how things happen in heaven and with God. And that is why it's really, really important. Really important to find ways to get on well. And as I said, I think the most important advice, certainly for me, in what Jesus says, is remember, Jesus is with us. That's the end of our activity. And now Hannah is going to tell us the Bible story. Thank you, Hannah.
Hear the Gospel of our Lord Jesus Christ, according to Matthew. Glory to you, O Lord. Jesus said, "If another member of the church sins against you, go and point out the fault when the two of you are alone. If the member listens to you, you have regained that one. But if you are not listened to, take one or two others along with you, so that every word may be confirmed by the evidence of 2 or 3 witnesses. If the member refuses to listen to them, tell it to the church. And if the offender refuses to listen even to the church, let such a one be to you as a Gentile and a tax collector. Truly I tell you, whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven. Again, truly I tell you, if 2 of you agree on earth about anything you ask, it will be done for you by my Father in heaven. For where 2 or 3 are gathered in my name, I am there among them." This is the Gospel of the Lord. Praise to you, O Christ.